Okay, this is a really interesting time period, 1730s and 40s, leading up to the American Revolution, about 20 years before. And this is a emotional religious revival. Lots of itinerant preachers traveling around the country, and of course, that Calvinist influence. So some questions that you're going to consider as you're as you're listening to this presentation. Why were colonists responsive to the preaching of these preachers, Whitefield and Edwards and others? Why were churches, including ministers, ready to adopt a more evangelical approach? And what were the social, economic, and political conditions that had an impact on people at this? So you do have some notes that you can download and fill in as you're listening to this presentation. So what was the awakening? It was basically a series of revivals led by itinerant preachers. And itinerant, of course, means traveling preachers that had an emphasis on personal faith instead of the conformity to services and icons and so forth. You've heard born again. They taught a new birth, a religious experience inspired by the Word of God, conversion. So you had a lot of people who felt great emotion when listening to these sermons. It wasn't formal. They had huge groups that would come. And emphasis on the individual instead of the preacher up there, the authority figure, and all the traditional aspects of religion. So we had 4 or 5 important preachers. We're going to concentrate on 2 of them. Theodore Frelinghuysen and William and Gilbert Tennant. They were absolutely preachers that traveled around, but Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield are the most prominent preachers during this time period. So Jonathan Edwards, he was the only son with 10 sisters, and his daddy was a preacher, and then he is going to write a series of sermons, a whole bunch of different sermons, and he is considered the most original and philosophical of the theologians, in America. He gets appointed to Princeton University as the president and dies. He goes there and dies of smallpox. So he wasn't there very, very long before he died. Now this is you can see it's a carving of Jonathan Edwards, and his most famous sermon is called, know this one, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. This is filled with all sorts of imagery. It is his best-known sermon, but it is not typical of Edwards. This one is a fire and brimstone, you're going to the bad place sermon if you do not stop that sinning. So this is his most famous. Know this sermon.
Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, delivered by Jonathan Edwards on July 8, 1741. Is remembered as the most famous sermon ever preached on American soil. Today, it appears in almost every anthology of American literature and stands alone as the only sermon included. It is an amazing text to the modern ear. Even those who absorb graphic imagery and language on a regular basis to the point of being numb to it are stricken with terror when they hear Edwards' stunning metaphor on the wrath of God. However, our reaction pales compared to how it was received when Edwards first delivered it. It is known as the sermon for which New England never forgave him. It sparked much controversy. It also sparked a fire that became known as the Great Awakening, a spiritual revival that left a permanent imprint on American life, pulling the colonies away from the ceremonial, detached ritual and discourse that marked European Christianity and breathing into it a new life of fervency and an acute understanding of the need for salvation. Edwards' reputation is one of a stern, loveless man. But that picture belies the truth. Those closest to Edwards described him as thoughtful, warm, sensitive, loving father, faithful husband, and a generous friend to the poor and distressed. Hell was a real place in Edward's mind, and therefore worthy of perpetual warning to avoid it at all costs. He prayed earnestly for his people to be awakened to the reality of sin and not to take for granted the sweetness of the gospel through Jesus Christ.
Interesting man. So this is some of the wording in Sinners in the Hand of a Mighty God. I need a Y there. The wrath of God is like great waters that are dammed for the present. The great earthly potentates in their greatest majesty and strength are but feeble, despicable worms of the dust in comparison to the great and almighty Creator and King of heaven. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear you in his sight. You are 10,000 times as abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. Pretty fiery language there. The other preacher we're going to talk about is George Whitefield, and he is going to come from England 7 different times. He is a very charismatic and popular preacher. At one point, he drew over 30,000 people to his sermon in Philadelphia. He spoke out against established churches. He preached about the spirituality of American slaves. And in these crowds, you had rich, poor, freedmen, enslaved people. And he delivered over 18,000 sermons. Benjamin Franklin, who was an atheist, was so stirred. So this is a painting of Whitefield. And he is considered one of the greatest evangelists. People were so enamored of him and came from miles around to hear him. They said he was as popular in his day as George Washington was. So very theatrical, waved his hands in the air, just was reaching out to people in a very emotional way. And if you've ever watched any of the modern evangelists, waving their hands, walking up and down a stage in front of an audience, that's what he's been compared to. Now, not everybody bought into this. We had, of course, the traditional religious people, and they called them the Old Lights. And they were very much against this evangelism. They said it was actually the devil's work. And if you look at this political cartoon, you can in the lower left-hand corner over here, there's a woman soliciting her wares, where men are coming to her. You can see there's a devil raking in money in the front there, and lots of symbolism. There's a devilish creature kind of pouring evil into the preacher's ear up there on the top, and just all sorts of symbolism going on in here. So one of the skills that we have with AP is looking at political cartoons and analyzing those cartoons. Up in the right-hand side towards the top, you see folks fighting, okay, and there's just a lot going on in this political cartoon. Phyllis Wheatley, who I believe Miss Barkley talked about with her book talk, one of the first published poet, she was an enslaved young girl, and then she will be freed, but she wrote a poem. It was a eulogy to Whitefield, and they eventually published her book of poems. But you can see this is supposed to be Whitefield there above the coffin, and when he died, she was so moved, she made a poem honoring Whitefield.